Hello! We are here today. I am joined by Wyatt Claypool from the National Telegraph, and we have another fun podcast. This time we're going to talk about, in general terms, voter choice theory, but in specifics, why don't the Liberals and the NDP merge? Why that
I
isn't
know this.
actually a thing.
Yeah, I know this annoys both of us whenever you and I or anyone else who likes to look at polling or just knows how politics actually works in Canada, whenever you see that narrative of like, why doesn't this party and that party just merge? I think in my own head that they're close enough, so why don't they just get together? And they just don't understand that, uh, you know, how voters actually choose their parties and how people generally they don't vote liberal because they don't vote liberal, and they don't vote NDP because they don't vote NDP, and so on and so on. People tend to choose parties for a reason, and it's not as simplistic as they should vote for the left party who's best at winning.
Yeah, the way people, I think, in a lot of ways, because we have this conceptualization of like the one-dimensional uh, policy line, like left, right, in its one dimension. Or even sometimes you have the more sophisticated two-dimensional, like libertarian chart that's like libertarian, authoritarian, left, right. People really think that politics is linear or that people fit on this chart. And yeah, maybe some politicos or some politicians you could put on this chart or on this line. But most people don't actually neatly map to anything. It depends on the issue, it depends on what you're talking about, because everything is way more complicated than people really give it credit for. This is an example I talk about all the time on my channel. My future father in law, big labor guy, social conservative on literally any issue you can name, fiscally liberal on literally every single issue you can name. What party does he vote for? It's
I'm
not an
gonna
easy
guess.
answer.
I'm gonna guess the Liberals, or used to maybe vote for the Liberals. I'm not sure this election.
This election, he's on the fence. He used to vote straight ticket NDP until Singh, because Singh got too socially liberal, and then he stopped voting NDP. Voted Trudeau in 19 and 21. Now he's uncertain.
And that's a more complex example, but you know what I mean, and the audience knows what I mean when I say that picture a very typical voter for each party. You can generally picture something in your mind, and I don't mean something hyperbolic like, oh, it's an NDP voter, pink hair, hates men or something like that. But you can generally picture NDP going to be a little bit more labor, maybe going to be a college town type youth voter. Liberals tends to be upper middle class, older pensioners, or people who live around Toronto. And then conservatives tends to be more people in trades, people in business, small business owners, kind of middle-aged voters. But people will still think, well, why don't X and Y party just get together? It's like, well, it's because one's X and one's Y. If X was Y, they would just be Y. There's a reason why these two parties disagree with each other, and why, like, nobody has ever stood up at a liberal or NDP convention and said, why don't we just merge with the other party? Because you aren't actually knowing what the people's priorities are who vote for these parties, because as similar as they might seem to you, they are different parties. Same with the PPC and the CPC. They are different parties, and that's why they exist separately.
Yeah, there's a interesting fallacy people have. And it's really easy to see in Canada's example, because people will look at the US and they'll see that it is a mostly firm two-party system. And they'll look at Canada and be like, well, 60% of Canadians vote for parties that are to the left of the Republicans, so therefore the Republicans are going to do terrible here. If Canada and the US in some hypothetical situation were one super country. And like maybe in the first election that would be the case, but if this was a long-term situation where both countries worked together for a long period of time so that weird unique political biases had homogenized, it would look very similar to the rest of the US. You'd probably be looking at 40-60% range for each party in each area. Because
And you can name a lot of issues too where it has nothing to do with, again, the abstract ideological spectrum. you go to Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, especially Alberta, and it would probably be a pretty default Republican state. Even though if you polled Albertans right now and said, "Do you want Donald Trump or Joe Biden?" they would say Joe Biden because that's the correct answer if you're in Canada at the moment. That really, in practice, though, when you look at our tax system in Alberta, we have lower taxes than most Republican states in the US. We have a generally pretty healthy small business community, oil and gas economy. It is kind of a mini Bible Belt of Canada. You're going to have a lot of very strong Republican type voters in rural areas, and then it would probably break down the way that the Alberta provincial election was. That Edmonton would be more of a Democrat voting city, but it still has blue collar areas, so you'd still get Republicans running up scores around certain neighborhoods. And then Calgary's kind of the divided area where everything ends up sort of battling down to, which is like a lot of Republican states. They're only Republican by 5 or 6%, but it's considered solid because that's very consistent how that state votes.
Mm. And this is just the overall thing with politics is individual voters, people will see that the complexity of the vote choices, but they don't like that it's so complex, that people actually have like very specific reasons, and often the specific reason is actually valid if you talk to the person for why they vote for who they want to vote for. But because they don't, the person in question who's looking at this and speculating, this mythical person, doesn't like how voter is voting, they're like, oh, people are irrational or don't know what they're voting for. They're being tricked. Which is actually like a really common thing you see, especially in left-wing circles, is that the working class is being tricked or psyoped by the right to vote against their interests. And it's like, but they're not. They're voting for the party that they think is going to do what they want.
Yeah. And that's why this series of podcasts that we might develop could just be called How Politics Actually Works. And the funny thing is, the people who seem to misunderstand how a typical voter thinks are so often the people who actually work closest in politics, or politics is that their like day job on Twitter. Even if they don't literally work in politics, you would be fooled by looking at their Twitter feeds. And it's just that they think that people vote on very hard ideological lines, and they vote in the exact same way that they think about the news. I mean, you think about the news as in terms of major stories. Well, whatever you feel about this major story is going to sort you into a certain political party. It's like, no, most people really vote on very vague feelings that they have, very small pet issues that they have. You'd be surprised what throws a lot of people off. And this is what also happens with the PPC, where tricked is the right word. You get a lot of the PPC influencers saying, well, people are still voting conservative or liberal because they're being tricked, because my party has the purest platform that has ever existed, so why wouldn't people vote for this? It's like, well, to put it simple, they vote for the party that they like, and if they didn't vote for your party, it's because they didn't like you, outside of maybe they don't even know that you exist because your marketing hasn't even reached them yet. But overall, they don't vote for you because they don't like you.
Mm. And with that too, as I've discussed before on my channel, especially on the right, there is this in a hierarchy system that's not it's not like a rigid thing. Like there's not like this is the SOCON block. We have meetings every day and we decide what to do. But there is this general sense of the leaders of different factions in the right in Canada or any jurisdiction. Who's good? Who's bad? In an example, federally, you have like the Campaign for Life coalition rates politicians. Like that's an example of this kind of organic thing existing. So voters, vaguely will support things in the faction that of the people that they like. So, you're vaguely like anti-abortion. Okay, you're gonna look at like the Campaign for Life coalition and vote for who they think because you trust them. That's how a lot of people vote. And that's not a wrong way to vote. And it's not an irrational way to vote. It makes perfect sense. But a lot of people don't like it because it's not the wonky way to vote.
Well, people want you to vote based on like metrics, that this person is like 10 out of 10 on this issue, that person's only a 6 out of 10 on that issue, as if voters are actually going to go through it and say, oh, on foreign policy, are they a 7? On economics, are they this? It turns more into a feeling of this person trustworthy or not, because that's why a lot of people vote, is because, are you trustworthy? Are you not? Do they seem to line up with my values? And that's why election after election, and we'll get into it on why liberal voters are not NDP voters and vice versa. There's decades of elections that happen in specific ridings where if the Liberals and NDP, or the Bloc and the Liberals, or the Conservatives and the Bloc, or whatever combination you can put in your mind, if they came together, they could overwhelm the current party that's held that riding for 2 decades, and they could do it fairly easily. But they've never gotten together, and nobody's ever proposed that they get together other than people who are on the internet too often. And they don't get together for a good reason. It's because they're not the same party, and they actively stand up for different values, even if you can vaguely say they technically agree on every issue. Just simply being in the same orbit on an issue doesn't mean that you're willing to water down your own principles in order to take their exact position. That's why the Liberals and the NDP tend to be fairly soft on crime in their criminal justice policy, but the Liberals are never going to do a full-on, decriminalization of drugs in a province that they run the same way that the NDP would.
Another good example that, too, just right now in the current political moment federally, is, the Liberals and the NDP are working together on things like dental and pharma, but they're not working in the way that both what's the way to phrase this? Each party wants a different thing from that system. The Liberals and the NDP both independently actually want both policies. That's why it's happening. If the Liberals did not want pharmacare, they wouldn't be doing it. Right? They actually want it. But the difference is they want different systems. So dental care is a really easy example. The NDP voter, the NDP party, a bit redundant there, but anyways, wants dental care to be universal. Everyone to be covered by public dental care. They don't like that the Healthcare Act does not include dentistry. The Liberals don't want universal dental care. They want dental care to cover for the poor. They don't want the rich to get it. It's
kind of like dental. It's kind of like dental Medicaid in the U.S., where it's for poor seniors. That's why it's being rolled out, and it started out ridiculously enough. It's like you had to be like 91 when it was first coming out to be able to actually sign up and qualify for it. And it's starting at those older ages because the Liberals have a bias towards older voters. I've said this before on other podcasts with you, and I've said it on my own show, that people who are actually older tend to be more disproportionately likely to vote for the Liberal Party than the NDP or the Conservatives. It's actually the 60-plus demographic that's the biggest Liberal Party voting bloc outside of just women in general. And so that's why the Liberals are rolling it out this way. The NDP would probably want the pharmacare program to be trying to cover more things that appeal to middle class and younger voters. But right now it's mostly covering medications for people who are older, have diabetes and other things. And then as a bone for the NDP, they threw in contraceptives, products that really don't cost all that much. But it's just basically throwing the NDP a bone for their very young demographic that tends to vote for them. And on dental care, the NDP would obviously want it to be just fully universal day one, because that would be the best way of appealing to younger voters who probably don't really need dental care right now, but they like the security that the dental care is provided because it's the just thing to do if you're a left-wing younger voter in general.
Yeah, I just brought up the most recent Angus Reid poll for just general vote intention from March 7th, because Angus Reid breaks it down by the finer age range, so it's easy to see. So here we have the second row is the Liberal vote intention, and 25 to 54, they're about flat. They're roughly 20%. And then 55 plus, the Liberals are up 29%. Where if you look at the Conservatives, they're roughly flat from 35 to 64, or around 43 plus or minus a little bit. But they're down to 39 at 65 plus and down at 31 under 35.
Yeah, and you'll notice that if you look at the NDP, then the NDP is the second place party right now, and obviously the Conservatives are ahead in all demographics. That's just the size of the lead. But when you look at the proportional like ratios of the lead, the NDP are in second, with younger voters at 18 to 35 crowd, and then the 60 plus, that's the Liberals actually tightening it up quite a bit with the Conservatives.
Yeah. So there is.
Which is funny that the Conservatives are actually the middle-aged party, which is a very strange kind of demographic to exclusively have, which is currently the best demographic just in sheer terms of numbers of the population.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons for that, though. Probably a little out of scope, but the general gist is the middle-aged demographic are the people who pay the most taxes and get the least services. Whereas the older you are, the more services you get, and you obviously probably retire and pay less taxes as a result. And the younger you are, you haven't really paid any taxes yet, so you've really only received services. So the middle-aged spectrum is always going to be the most conservative spectrum. Then you have like generational effects too, where the boomer generation was just historically very liberal. And I mean like capital L liberal, not like necessarily speaking like liberal in the modern sense of the term, but liberal party liberal. If that makes sense.
And then maybe this is a good time to bring up the merge of the voting intentions with people willing to support someone to block another party.
Yeah. So we have this other Angus Reid poll here, and bear with me 1 second. So you can see here we have this Angus Reid poll. This is from a little farther back. I don't actually have. I guess I can scroll to the top. I don't care. So this is back. I think it was back in January. So this is the vote intention by decided support. So you can see here 26% are voting conservative because they want to vote conservative. 9% are voting liberal because they want to vote liberal. And then the other ones. 15% of people are voting liberal to block the CPC, and 15% are voting CPC to block the liberals. Down here, you look at likely to switch to the liberals. This is a very dubious statistic, though I don't think it's entirely wrong regarding the NDP. If you watch my video out last week, you will know federally that I think the NDP is dropping to 14% probably in the long term. So this doesn't seem actually that unreasonable, though the conclusion that the Liberals will gain points I think is unreasonable. But anyways.
Well, and it's just the fact that simply asking the question, are you likely to switch, is almost illegitimate from the start. Because if the person was willing to switch, they'd probably already be telling you in the poll. If they have to be made aware of the idea of switching, then they wasn't part of their calculus. That's the obnoxious thing about issue polling, which we both have a problem with. You can't poll someone on an issue that they don't know anything about, in which your phrasing creates sort of micro implications on what is the correct answer. And even this is the micro implication, is that it's probably good to vote liberal in order to block them. The idea is that you can block them if you switch votes. But on the ground, no matter what riding you're in, not that many voters are going to be educated enough to be able to say, oh yes, if I switch from this party to that party, then it's going to prevent someone I don't like from getting into office. And at the end of the day, people are always going to lean more heavily towards voting for the party they like rather than just voting against the party they don't like. You got to, at the end of the day, actually show up to vote for something, not just against something. And even in this, we still see 13% of the NDP, 7% of the Bloc, 3% of the Greens, and the other doesn't really matter. But the vast majority of people even supporting these parties, even in a poll that's skewed towards saying it's a good idea to vote to block the Conservatives by implication, even most people are saying, I won't do it.
Yeah, the important thing to note, too, just to add to Wyatt's comment there, Pew Research recently just published a big symposium on opt-in bias polls. This is particularly bad for internet polls, which Angus Reid is an internet poll, where Pew was noting that they're actually internet polls are actually relatively good at specific vote intention. So, like, who do you plan on voting for right now? Internet polls seem to be fine for that if they're doing proper weighting and all that stuff, right? But Pew was pointing out that if you ask for issue polls or you ask for other things, because of the opt-in bias to the poll and because of affirmative response bias, people are likely going to just give you the affirmative answer because of how this works out. That's how you can get polls that say 20% of people are, what is the deny the Holocaust is in Pew's example, and then Pew did a proper, normal, randomly sampled telephone poll, and found it was actually like 2%.
Mm-hmm.
Because
it was like
the opt-in bias and the affirmative response bias made people. It skewed to people who didn't actually care about answering properly. They're just answering the poll for money. And then it skews to people just wanting to say the thing that is the most dramatic. Like, you're going to get people who are going to say, yeah, I'm going to vote Liberal to block the CPC because it's the dramatic thing to say.
it would be like if you just put in different party options that you could select, especially if they're all displayed on the screen together and you don't have to wait for like the 10th option on the phone poll past all the legitimate options. If you just put some gibberish letters and words on as an option that you could pick, you're going to have a certain percentage of people who are like that. It's like, there's a reason why it doesn't matter especially if you're a school teacher, if you try and like do anything in a classroom with kids, there's going to be one kid who's going to try and intentionally screw it up for the fun of it. And that is what happens with polling as well.
Yeah.
This is why the other option should pretty much be eliminated. On this poll, it basically just means PPC, but the other option effectively doesn't mean anything. Either the party's worth polling or it's not, because other is nebulous and doesn't mean anything, and voters feel smart in a certain sense for saying other, because it's like basically saying, oh, I think that I'm above partisanship, and you're really not.
Yeah, just to add a detail to that, other is one of the most historically overpolled categories in Canada. The only party that overpolls more than other, and by that I mean the polls overestimate them systemically, is the Green Party. And the Green Party is just hilariously systemically overpolled.
Well, and part of it's because people in the media tend to have a sort of soft spot for the Greens, so the Greens get talked about a lot. So it seems like an option that voters should take more seriously. So whether it's phone polls or online polls, you feel like the unique smart person for picking Green, because it feels like that it's the cutting edge of left-wing politics if you're a more center-left voter. But you're still just going to vote Liberal or NDP because you actually don't really know anything about the Greens.
Mm.
And most people don't realize it's probably one of the biggest conspiracy theorist parties in the country. People always go after the right for that. The Green Party is the repository of actually really wacky type of ideas when it comes to political issues.
And just to go back to the main topic at hand here, which is the Liberal NDP switcher. So we actually have a good amount of data on this. Despite what a lot of polls say, despite what a lot of people say, or not polls, sorry, the polls are correct. Despite what a lot of pundits say, despite what a lot of like random conventional wisdom is. Though all that wisdom is wrong, and all the pundits are usually wrong. The NDP Liberal vote switcher, in proportion, is about the same as the Conservative to NDP switcher. So I won't have it on screen here because I don't have it in a nice format, but I have my model models this naturally because that's what I do. And 9.4% of 2021 NDP voters plan on voting Conservative now, and 9.2% of 2021 NDP supporters plan on voting Liberal now. 9.62% of 2021 Liberals plan on voting Conservative, and 13.1% plan on voting NDP. See, you're like, the switchers between the NDP and the Conservatives, and the Liberals and the Conservatives, and the Liberals and the NDP, and the NDP and the Liberals, these are about the same proportion. It's not that dramatically different. And just the Conservatives here, 3.5% plan on voting Liberal, and 2.7% plan on voting NDP. Like, again, almost the same proportion here.
Well, here's another one that most people don't bring up as much. A lot of PPC voters in 2019 and 2021 were Green Party voters. A lot of them were Green Party. And you just talk to enough people and they used to vote Green. And it's because it has a similar appeal to people who have very, what I would call, granola naturalist kind of views about government.
Yeah, I don't have that data on hand here. Actually, let's see if I have it. You just
That is a little bit more of like a colloquial kind of like, you know it if you talk to enough people, that there's a lot of former Greens who end up in the PPC. Like even a bunch of the PPC organizers are former anti-oil and gas guys. Daniel Tyree, their like executive director, is.
No, I don't have. I didn't keep the data for back 2021 election, so unfortunately I cannot.
That's one of the
Wyatt
one
is
of the
definitely
ones where people just
correct
have to take
there.
my word for it.
That data is there. I just don't have it on hand, and it's also a bit tricky in the current polling situation because the PPC are polling low enough that any bias is going to be microscopic from like vote switchers.
And the thing is, the reason why we see these kind of very evenly divided vote switching between the conservatives, liberals, and NDP, well, obviously you aren't showing the conservative data because the whole point is that the conservatives are holding on to the vast majority of their voters right now, so there's not a big sample size of conservatives voting for other parties. But the reason why you end up seeing a lot of these people willing to switch is because of local issues on the ground. Is because a conservative to NDP switch in Alberta or an NDP to conservative switch makes a lot more sense than a NDP to conservative switch in Toronto. It's because the conservatives and the NDP would be considered much more anti-corporate type options when you're in a place like Alberta rather than Toronto, where the NDP liberal kind of dichotomy is more about progressivism than it is about kind of, hard scrabble, blue collar opposition to very kind of corporatist type liberal politics.
Hmm. And just as another good, I think a really good case to look for this at this too, a lot of NDP support historically, it's getting less and less so every year, but historically, up until about roughly nowish, has been really concentrated in, as Wyatt was saying, like places like Alberta, like working class areas in Alberta or Ontario. And those areas, you look at like London Fanshawe right now, that's not swinging conservative right now, which my model is showing if you've watched last week's video. It's swinging conservative not just because like liberal voters are going conservative because that's the next one party in line. It's because a lot of NDP voters are going conservative. Because in towns like that, or in towns in like coastal BC, or parts of Manitoba, or other areas where the NDP is actually strong, if you don't like the current liberal government, the only person you can vote for is the conservatives. And a lot of these parties and a lot of these people don't like the liberal government because they're doing things that don't actually help unionized or working class voters at all.
And again, that's another thing about the current demographic that the liberals mostly serve. Because some people say, well, why would anyone vote liberal? And you and I both have this happen in our comments all the time. You'll talk about a poll and like, hey, this poll's crazy. The liberals are all the way down to only 23%. The conservatives are at 43%. And people will immediately say, I can't believe the liberals are still at 23%. And like, yeah, you might be shocked, but you know that there's a lot of pensioners in Eastern Canada who like the very consistent benefits that the liberals tend to deliver to them. They grow pensioner benefits over time. And yes, you're correct too, because like the NDP is a labor party for people who are still working. So those people are not totally obsessed with their current federal CPP benefits. They tend to care more about their actual current income. So they're more swayable on issues of taxation than a retired voter who doesn't actually make any more income outside of their CPP, which is not putting them anywhere close to being taxed a lot. So that's why you got a lot of conservative provinces provincially. The fight is always between conservative NDP, where you think it would be based on a political spectrum. Well, shouldn't it be conservative liberal because they're the closest together, so naturally they can steal voters from each other? Like, no, the Liberal Party collapsed in places like Saskatchewan and Alberta and Manitoba because it's not the type of party that gets that kind of younger, wage earning type voter out to vote. The Liberals are very much a party for kind of older upper middle class landowners.
Yeah. And the other thing worth noting with that too, there is a certain element which I think a lot of people in regular punditry in the last 20 years, maybe more, 30 years, 40 years, have completely systemically gotten wrong. And it's like the conventional wisdom that you, if you remember back to 2022 in the conservative leadership race, people being like, you need to elect a moderate leader to win the swing voter. They don't want the right-wing extremist Poilievre. They want a moderate voter. They want someone comfortable, comfy, like an Aaron O'Toole.
Jean Charest.
Like Jean Charest. That wisdom is just wrong, and Alberta, Saskatchewan, BC, Manitoba are the best case studies for it. The NDP is more, in general terms, different than the Conservatives, than the Liberals in those provinces used to be to the Conservatives. So why did the Liberals die? Because people don't want... If they don't like the Conservatives anymore, they don't like the Conservative government, they want a different government. They don't want discount Conservatives. And likewise, federally, if they don't like the Liberals anymore and they want to get Trudeau out, they're not voting discount Trudeau.
Yeah, and I'm not saying the advice is nefarious, but it's so funny that the swing voter, when you actually detail out who they're saying the swing voter is, it is like the default Liberal voter. The swing voter, as described by a lot of media pundits, is like a woman who's 55, kids moved out of the house, they own a home in like a suburb in Toronto. That is your swing voter. It's like, no, that actually is not. That is the voter I am least likely to win. That would be like in, the US, that you were describing a swing voter being a black female Democrat living in Detroit. It's like, no, that's actually a very, very establishment Democratic voter. You want someone who is more swayable, and it's usually the people who have the most, and not in, again, a way of like you're trying to manipulate someone, but you're trying to find the voter who has the most pressures on them, economically, socially, who is more willing to switch votes based on the pressures they have. That's the problem with a retiree voter, is because they don't have an income. They really don't care about housing policy. That's how the Liberals started screwing up so much on housing policy. That wasn't a factor on their radar, not because they're heartless, somewhat, because someone could argue that, but it's because their voting base doesn't care about housing, because they all own their homes. So they don't need to care about it, and that's why they're scrambling all over themselves, because they realize that now they actually do need some middle age and younger voters in order to actually have a chance at winning the next election. So they're desperately trying to push for housing subsidies and different other schemes in order to build more homes and get more people into homes, because for too long they've gotten used to their voting base not caring about that issue, not caring about if they're taxing the rich too much or businesses too much. Now they actually do have to sort of pull back a little bit, and that's where you have Justin Trudeau in press conferences trying to accuse everyone else of wielding the heavy hand of government except himself, because he knows he has to actually pivot a little bit more to like a free market position.
And that's the other thing that's, I think, quite important as well to conceptualize here. The Liberal Party and the NDP are appealing to two historically different categories, as Wyatt's saying. They're heavily to the retiree, older voters, the Liberals, but they're also really heavily into the government bureaucracy, which is another reason why the Liberals seem very absent-minded about the economy, because their voter base, being government heavily skewed into government bureaucrats, is not very concerned with the economy. Their jobs aren't directly affected by it. They're not that worried about it. They're all...
And wage increases happen fairly automatically, if not just after a short 2-week protest.
Yeah, exactly. Where the NDP historically has been more of the trade union or the low-income private sector worker, the cashier at Loblaws. Those people are much more susceptible to price shocks and economic shocks, and are more willing to do something about it. The quote-unquote economically populist left vote, if you will, is like the stereotypical historic NDP voter, and they don't actually vote for the Liberals that much, and they're not transient to the Liberals.
And you'll look at conservative and NDP narratives, and obviously you and I are both conservative, so we naturally actually agree with the conservative position, but the conservatives and NDP both have economic injustice narratives. The conservatives more about the fact that you are having all your hard work taxed away from you, you're not able to operate your small business, you're not able to climb the ladder without the government getting your way. But the NDP do the same thing, and that's why, you're right, It's the private sector, trade unionist voters, sometimes lower level government employees are more likely to vote NDP, and it's because economic and justice arguments are very appealing to those people, where liberal voters, if they are bureaucrats or if they do work for the government or if they do work in the private sector, far more service industry oriented and white collar people who, have their own offices, work in HR, and attend, they attend team building meetings every week.
And it's actually quite interesting with that note, because I've said this before many times on Twitter, if you follow me on Twitter. I think if I wanted to, not that I do, but if I had full control over the NDP comms, I'm pretty sure I could have them firmly in second place because, yeah, I'm conservative, yes, but the populist right and populist left economic arguments are not that different. They're different, obviously, they're left right, but they're not that different. Like, to take the comm skills from one to the other would not be very difficult, and I'm convinced I could do it. I don't think I'd bring them in the first place, but I could definitely bring them in the second place polling.
You're a man after my own heart, because half of my show is just based on telling parties I don't even like how their comm sucks and how they could improve. If the Liberals just subscribe to my channel, they might be doing far better, because their ability to communicate through marketing is terrible. This is why I have actually heard there's a rumor that the Liberals want an election this November so they can have it coincide with the American presidential election. But like the NDP, yeah, like they're it's like did you see the TikTok videos the Ontario NDP were putting out?
Oh, the cat things, yeah.
Yeah, like that's why you guys are losing. Not that specifically, but that is like a symbol of the giant sucking void of all the missed opportunities that you guys have had. You guys have not put out a single thing about stable middle class labor jobs. If they just, start branding on stable middle class labor jobs, they would be doing way better. But they're constantly kind of whining about things that only, frankly, Toronto liberal office workers care about.
So that's something I touched on in my last video. I think the reason why the current NDP under Singh is just completely and utterly failing to actually make use of the populist left position that it could use to, I think, quite good success electorally is because Singh has decided the NDP in its traditional political spectrum, the traditional political position, can't win. So his entire leadership of the NDP has been, well, we're going to try to become the Liberals. We're going to moderate on economics. We're going to be more socially liberal than them, and we're going to try to take the Senate. We're going to take their professional urbanite voter from Toronto. We're going to take their bureaucrat voter in Ottawa. We're going to take the retiree, etc. And this is precisely why the NDP is doing horrific right now, even though the Liberals are also doing terrible. This should be a time when the NDP should be doing well.
And here's the funny thing: they can't win the type of voters that the Liberals have, the older female pensioners, because the NDP scares those people, because those same voters who like the consistent and increasing benefits that the Liberals hand out, that they like the stability that brings. The problem with it is that the NDP, by trying to outbid the Liberals on the amount of programs that they'll support and how much they'll put into those programs and all the other stuff, that even though they're technically giving the voter what they want, those voters are very sensitive to too much radicalism, because it makes them feel like their benefits, their CPP, their pension is at risk. And the funny thing is, now with the Liberals trying to compete with the NDP on their flank, even though the NDP aren't even a threat to the Liberals on these issues, now Trudeau's leaning into some NDP positions on these issues, increasing benefits, pushing for pharmacare and universal dental, which is freaking out these voters who already had dental plans and everything like that, and are now scared of too much government spending, so they might vote conservative now, thinking that these two parties might actually ruin us all if they actually keep pushing for too much spending.
Which then goes, basically the thesis of my entire last video soundbite right there. But it puts into a very interesting position, and this is the narrative you're seeing a lot of, I think, centristy, center-lefty political pundits like what's the I can't think of any of their names off my head, but anyways,
Max Fawcett.
like Max Fawcett, yeah, that's a good one. Are like completely in denial right now about, say, the carbon tax. Why is the carbon tax such a big, quote unquote, communication failure? Well, the first thing is it's actually not a communications failure. Most people understand they get rebates. Most people at least understand the idea that the rebates are supposed to be proportional or more. There might be some intricacies, there might be some voters who don't understand, but most people are aware of that. The reason why the carbon tax is suddenly unpopular, because it wasn't unpopular in 21. Everyone should remember in 2021, Aaron O'Toole ran away from the carbon tax. He promised to axe it, and he ran away from it because he thought it was too popular. That doesn't just happen. It's because there was something to it. It wasn't unpopular in 2021. Why is it unpopular now?
The only thing I'd argue on that is I think there was still, if you did like we can't do polling on it because it's actually a very hard issue to do polling on. Like you've seen the polls where people are like, do you think we need a carbon tax to combat, carbon emissions? And it basically implies that it's combating it. So that's why you get like wonky results even these days showing that the carbon tax might be 57% popular. But I think what happened with O'Toole more so, and this is, I would agree, the carbon tax was still not as unpopular then as it is now. It was probably more of a 50-50 or maybe a 40-60, and O'Toole should have been smart in taking the 40. But I think back then, O'Toole was under the impression, because of stupid polling, that people deeply cared about the environment. It was one of everyone's top 3 issues. And it's like, it's not. I maybe, like, we can talk a little bit about this, but, and this kind of will actually kind of roll into the PPC's appeal, and why it's been falling off, is that people really only have one issue, but O'Toole, because there's way too much focus grouping going on in a lot of federal parties, they're convincing themselves that, well, not only is the carbon tax maybe 55-60% popular, but 28% of conservative voters say the environment's extremely important to them. So if we get rid of the carbon tax, we might lose a giant portion of our base. And they're trying to overcomplicate the issue and trying to cobble together their coalition. And I think he was getting a little bit too cute by, trying to add a little bit of this and tone down a little bit of that, trying to create the perfect platform, when it was, we talked about this before, it's more about the vibes of the leader that tends to get people to show up. Not that that's all that happens, but it's a very important factor is, do you feel like this person's stable? And Aaron O'Toole, in trying to seem like the perfectly calculated politician, seemed actually very unstable and kind of unstrung.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I'll just finish here. So the reason why there's been this change in the carbon tax, as Wyatt said, it was probably like 50-60 or 40-60 before. Popular to unpopular. And it seems to be about switched now, if you actually like look at it and like did a more sophisticated thing. That's what I would wager it is. And the reason that switch happened isn't because people are suddenly caring less about the environment. And it's not suddenly because people feel like they're getting ripped off by the carbon tax. It's not suddenly because whatever. That hasn't changed. None of the arithmetic has changed. It's solely because of the Conservative Party, for the most part, painting it this way, but also the Liberals accepting the framing. The carbon tax is like the principal and premier policy of the Liberal government. It's their like main thing. The main thing they've done in the last 10 years of government. And since it's their main thing that they've done, they can point to, we did this. And the last 10 years have just sucked. Crime's up, GDP sluggish, if not negative, if you look at per capita. Housing is just horrific. All these things are just terrible. People think everything sucks. So they're anti-carbon tax. Not strictly because they've changed their mind that the carbon tax or the environment or whatever. They're anti the Trudeau government, and they just want to get rid of everything he's done. Because whatever he did was bad.
And there's a lot to it, too, that when people are more prosperous, They're more willing to think good things about whatever the intentions are behind a policy. And if you just basically take that same voter and minus $20,000, they're far more likely to just be suspicious of things that you're doing. So it's not that the person's reading of the policy has changed. They, like you said, have all the information from the beginning. The only thing that changed was the financial calculus, that now they hate the carbon tax because they're not doing well financially, and it has tax in the name, which is why they're trying to rebrand it, which, as silly as it is, and as much as I'd make fun of them trying to rebrand it, probably the move that they actually need to do if they're not just going to put a pause on it, which may be the better move, but they want to save face and pretend that they're still in support of their own policy. But really, the calculus all mattered with people are willing to put up with silly stuff when they have more money in the bank.
Yeah, there's a certain thing in, I think, the more rigorous or more sophisticated side of the poli-sci world. I hate saying that sentence, but anyways,
Yeah, you sound like Justin Burroughs. The political science community, as I think he referred to himself as.
But the more rigorous and sophisticated side of this, who are actually like more into the political, like trying to understand political theory and not just push policies, there is this thing called luxury political beliefs, and the name is the dead giveaway there. It's something that a population will hold to while they have money, while they're prosperous. And as soon as they're not prosperous, that disappears.
And here's a great example: is criminal justice reform. That is a very luxury type belief. It's like when you go down to American cities with crazy high crime, it is the black residents of that city saying, please bring back the police, please tighten up the law, even though you have richer, upper middle class people who live in the suburbs where there's less crime are the people trying to pass it to supposedly benefit those people who live in the inner city.
Yeah, it's also quite funny too, because this kind of plays into the overall housing thing. Because a lot of the YIMBY activists are always like, oh, North American cities are so bad because everyone left the inner city. This is mostly talking about the US perspective, but it's a little true in Canada too, though not as much. Everyone left the cities and they're on the suburbs. Suburbanization is terrible. And it's like, no, wait. You're looking at this rock backwards. Suburbanization occurred because no one wanted to do something about crime. The reason why all these suburbs are really expensive is because that's the only way to keep out the gangster population. They can't afford to live in these communities. That's literally the truth. That's why
100%.
Suburbs exist.
Yeah, and you'll see that, like, very much there's a lot of I don't mean this in like the hard 1960s Alabama sense, but there you get a lot of segregation in suburbs of specific communities trying to move to specific areas just because they want to get away from another specific group in a different part of the city who tends to have greater crime problems or greater issues with social dysfunction.
The U.S. has a lot of good stats on this. You look at like Chicago now versus Chicago 50 years ago, and it's actually more segregated now. You have Hispanic neighborhoods, you have Asian neighborhoods, you have black neighborhoods, you have white neighborhoods, and those are the main races that the U.S. classifies. But they're very clear different neighborhoods. And before, in the like 1960s and 70s, it was a little more intermixed, but now it's completely stratified, more or less.
And this was maybe a weird kind of a transition, but that actually makes me now want to talk about the PPC a little bit and how I think that also the way that people sort of have self-segregated themselves when it comes to different cultures in cities is one of the reasons why I feel like a lot of people, when they're trying to start new parties and they've sort of been on online politics too much, don't understand how the typical voter, especially the typical voter across multiple different communities, actually thinks about politics. And so moving on from like the liberal NDP, why don't they vote together? Well, it's because they're not the same party. They believe different things. We've been over that. And now, why is it that people didn't go and vote for the PPC? And this is something that I'm wanting to talk about just because I have a bunch of PPC people still going after me on social media as if I'm somehow behind the fact that they haven't like been wildly successful. And I think that the stats you have up on screen are a good way of looking at it. Right now, the PPC, not only are they only sitting around like 1% or 2% overall nationally, or yeah, it's 2% nationally, You look at them across the entire country, and you can't find a specific stronghold that they do well in. They do well in places like New Brunswick as the Christian Heritage Party. And why is that? It's because, like, well, the party never targeted a specific voter. It's a party for legitimately people who just like the entire PPC platform, which if you're hoping that your voters are going to go read your platform, you're crazy. I'm running for the Calgary Signal Hill Conservative Party nomination. The amount of people who actually will go and read my priorities list or platform, it's minimal. It's probably less than 10% of people who will vote for me actually read the thing. Is because that's not a concern for people. And this is where I kind of want to talk a little bit more about how politics actually works and explain to these people that you actually need to go door knocking and you need to actually touch grass and talk to some of these people and realize that not every single person cares deeply about the weird foreign policy issues that you care about.
That's, I think, a really good. The PPC, I think, is a good case study on why there's this kind of a maxim that a lot of people have, and it's like you should try to appeal to all voters. And it's like, no, you shouldn't. You shouldn't try to do that. You shouldn't intentionally attack or alienate a voter. Don't do that. That's bad. But you shouldn't create a policy, your platform, your party, to equally satisfy everyone. Because you can't do it. It's literally impossible. You can't have the government bureaucrat, the trade unionized worker, and the small business owner all collectively happy with you unless your opposition is literally crayon-eating morons.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen.
And that's why Brian Mulroney and the PC's party fell apart in the 1993 election. Is it became the party for nobody. It's like it's supposed to be the party for like small business owners and different people who are like middle class wage earners. At the same time, it's the party that was refusing to cut any government spending because it didn't want to bother any pensioners or anyone who's very social service reliant. And so the Liberals ended up eating their lunch because they're like, okay, we'll cut the spending. And then they end up absorbing this massive group of underserved voters that the Reform Party was just not, materializing fast enough to have monopolized themselves. And so the PPC, whenever I talk to people who are very frustrated with the fact that the Conservative Party has reabsorbed all the support that they had gained in 2021, it seems like they always are confused by the fact that people don't react the same way to their platform that they did when they joined up and they decided that they were going to they're going to stand this party on social media all day long. And a lot of it is just the fact that you can say all of the right things to someone. The Maverick Party on this chart in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba is 0% because people don't care. And it's not just because they don't have the ability to win doesn't mean you shouldn't support them. We've already been over that. People will support the party who's always going to come in fourth or third place in the same riding for 2 decades, even though if they switch to the Liberals, in theory, the Liberals could beat the Conservatives or the Conservatives could beat the Liberals. They don't do it because they don't want to. People don't vote for the People's Party of Canada and they don't support Maxime Bernier because they don't like them. And they don't like them because they do not make people feel stable. The entire party's platform is actually about making people feel very unstable. And I don't mean that in the sense that mean, nasty people making people feel bad. I mean it in the sense that your entire platform is about how everything's terrible and that we will basically oppose all of the terrible things. It's like, but there's no actual kind of silver lining of hope in any of it. And so so it becomes a last ditch effort party. And so when they had their 2021 election result that was way higher than in 19, they like doubled their votes. That didn't actually result in a giant, sale of memberships and stronger EDAs being built, because this is like the way the party advertises itself is literally the break glass and pull the alarm party. So that you don't have people constantly doing that election after election if you're the last ditch party. You're like the party on the way to the apathy room.
Or the way out of the apathy room.
But back into the apathy room when it doesn't work out because you've labeled everyone else as like horrible people.
There is I talked about this a bit on X, formerly known as Twitter, which is funny to say, but
I keep saying Twitter. Oh goodness, X always sounds like a verbal error.
It does. It does. I normally just use Twitter, but every now and then I say X, formerly known as Twitter, because it's so stupid. It's funny to me. Um, but I outlined this the other day on Twitter. So if you want to succeed as a political party, you actually need to adopt a certain percentage of the orthodoxy of the current moment. Because if you go the other way, like the PPC is doing, and it's entirely unorthodox, you want to change the orthodoxy of Canada entirely. The only way that's going to work is if you have something like Argentina in last year, when Miley won, when the economy of the country is just so bad, people don't want it anymore. That's how someone like Miley, who wants to change everything, can win. But Canada has not ever historically been to the point where there's just no redeeming qualities. And it took Argentina 90 years to get there. Of just
And here's the here and here's
horrific
the
government.
and the thing is that, yeah, people in Argentina in that election, like if you were to rate people, and you could probably even pull this, if you were to have people rate themselves out of 10 on emotional desperation or emotional focus on this election, how emotionally invested are you in it? You'd probably in Argentina average people at an 8.5, because that's just how bad the country had gotten. In Canada, I think that in any election, check people's pulse, they're at like a 3.5, 4.5 on average. Most people do not care about the election that much. It is crazy if you actually talk to people at their doors, how many people who do not like Justin Trudeau, but, I don't really care to vote in a nomination race. Or, yeah, I'm not even sure if I'm going to vote. I might go, on vacation in November of 25 or whatever. It's just not on. People do not have politics on their radar the same way. And that is the fundamental action problem of and again, this is going back to sort of public choice theory or voting theory, is that people vote for a party that makes them feel stable. So with the Greens and the PPC, they need you to be at like an 8 out of 10 in terms of emotional elevation to cast that ballot. And it's very hard to find people on a sleepy suburban neighborhood who are at that point. And so the PPC never also kind of legitimized themselves by winning both Bernier's riding in 2019 or 21. And so that was also another hit at their stability. You feel like you're actively casting a vote into the void. You're not actually doing that. People cast their votes into the void every single election. You could say, frankly, most votes are cast into the void in most ridings. But the thing is that with the PPC, that you actually do feel like that this is not even going to contribute to winning, because my guy in my area can't win, and he seems like he's on about a bunch of stuff that I don't care about. And being really turned up about something that people do not care about actually does make them very much dislike you. When you come up to someone's house and you're telling them about like the WF, the UN, and they don't know what you're talking about, it actually makes people very uncomfortable. But a lot of people who tend to be very online eccentrics don't understand the kind of buttons that you accidentally press with people when you sort of rant a little bit too much about topics that are way outside the bounds of what they consider a normal political issue.
Yeah, which is exactly why, as I was saying, you need a party that wants to be successful has to adopt most of the orthodoxy. So in your hypothetical scale, there, the average voter is like a 3.5 on the oh no, everything is falling apart scale. If that's where the average voter is, that's where your party needs to be. Because if you're out of sync with that, people are not going to take you seriously. You'll get some voters, sure. You can't. You have to be tremendously bad to get 0 voters, but you won't win if if you're not in sync with the current orthodoxy of most things. That doesn't mean you have to do the exact same thing that everyone does. That's also terrible. You don't want to be 100% orthodox. You lose then, because there's always a problem. You can't fix everything in society. It's literally impossible to fix every problem. We are just not capable of that as people. But what you want to do as a party is be like 85% of the current status quo. We're going to keep 85% of it, and we're going to change 15% of it in a way that makes sense with our party and our brand. So like the Conservatives going in, oh no, we have affordability issues. What are the Conservatives going to do? We're going to cut taxes. Like that would be a conservative thing to do. That's on brand. That'll help affordability, etc., etc. The NDP solution might be we're going to create a new entitlement program. The Liberal solution is, I don't know, failure, because that's what they're doing right now. And that's like the overall gist.
You have to pick something that is in your brand and in your thing that makes sense to your voters, your base, and the average voter is in the same intensity level as everybody else.
Also, every single voter thinks that they're centrist. Pretty much, there's not that many voters who don't consider themselves centrist. Like, let's say out of all the people who vote, not counting just non-voters, I'd say probably only about 20% of people actually consider themselves on the left or the right. The vast majority of people consider themselves on the center, even if they actually have very left or right views. And the problem with running something like the PPC or the Greens is that they actively advertise themselves as being very left wing or very right wing. That, oh, hey, are you cool enough to be part of this party because we're super left or right? And so that makes people uncomfortable. Even if you showed them your platform, they might agree with you on pretty much everything. They just don't want to join something that makes them seem like a zealot in a certain sense. That's where you'll have, and the PPC will jump on this, not realizing it's just a smart thing to say. But Pierre Poilievre says, the Conservatives are a centrist party. And they'll be like, oh, they're centrist, so they don't want to get rid of half the liberals' policies, or they agree with Trudeau on this and that. No. He is trying to make people comfortable with voting conservative because people have, I'm not going to say propagandized, but people just have the general feeling that it's probably bad to be anywhere hard that's very hard and fast on the political spectrum, or just taking very hard and fast views. This is why Barry Goldwater does really bad in the 1964 presidential election, because he marketed himself as being the very right-wing conservative, like explicitly, I am the right-wing conservative. And then Ronald Reagan smashes Jimmy Carter in 1980, effectively running on the exact same sort of things as Barry Goldwater. I am just like an all-around American centrist type guy. He never said centrist, but he very much made himself like, I am a middle-class type American choice.
Yeah, and to go back to the Miley example in Argentina, why did he do so well? Why did a radical libertarian come in and manage to do things like got the Argentinian central bank and axe all these departments? How did he manage to do that? That's so radical. Because the situation in Argentina was that bad. People's elevated level was, as Wyatt was saying, it was like 8.5. People were just, they wanted everything gone. That's not the situation in Canada or the US or anywhere else. Even if you feel like everything is like blood and ashes, like the world is ending, the average voter doesn't. An example, a lot of my friends are actually not that out of sync with me. Obviously, there's some differences. We're not the same person. But if I talk to them about, say, the housing crisis, and I talk about, like, I mentioned immigration, and I talk about it in, like, a very centrist way, they agree with me. If I were to take a different issue or similar issue, and I talk about it from the very right-wing perspective, their walls are up. They're like, no, we shouldn't do that. That's bad. And it might seem incoherent or inconsistent from this person, but it's not. Because the framing, how you frame something, how you phrase something, how you articulate something matters a lot. There's a very big difference to say, oh, we should reduce the amount of people we have because we can't, or immigration we're having because we can't house everyone. We don't have doctors for everybody. And we should deport all the people. Those are very different sentences.
100%. I've had this happen to me over the last 24 hours on X, formerly known as Twitter, where there's a lot of PPC guys who go and say, well, hey, is Pierre Poilievre committing to a immigration moratorium? And you'll notice on immigration, Pierre Poilievre, if you actually track his statements, has never embraced mass immigration. And no politician has ever stooped enough to literally embrace that verbiage. But he actually has over time said things that are that are heavily indicating he wants to restrict immigration. I've heard from behind the scenes. He also generally favors the plan that I've been marketing in my riding. He is wanting to reduce immigration. But then you'll get a PPC type guy saying, well, does he want an immigration moratorium? And then I just kind of like get very quizzical. I look at these people very quizzically and just think, okay, go to someone's door. And I don't want to turn everything into, I'm going to challenge you to go door knocking or something like that. But actively try and get someone who's on the fence on that issue to agree with you on a moratorium. And then you'll realize that, okay, do I need a moratorium, or can I just say, let's cap it at 130,000 for the next 5 years? And like, is it that much? of a horrible thing to have to meet a little bit in the middle with people? Well, not really, but the whole point is that when when you've convinced yourself that only the most pure position can work, then you make it very difficult to reach that voter because it becomes like a challenge in order, like, it legitimately comes, are you a bad enough dude to vote PPC because look at what we stand for on X, Y, and Z issue? Are you up to snuff with us? Which again is why I made the joke on X, formerly known as Twitter, one day that when the last PPC member is like, sitting in a room by himself after everyone else has left the party, the guy will have to denounce himself as a globalist, because there is a toxic thing that happens in small parties of a lot of purity testing going on, that you're in a small room and it makes you feel a little bit like it almost makes you kind of counteract the fact that you don't have as much success by leaning on the fact that you have greater principles or more understanding of the system than everyone else, and that leads you over time to start just punting people. I literally know people who've been kicked out of the PPC because they didn't agree with Maxime Bernier on something, and then these same people are telling you that I'm scared of the PPC because I'm criticizing them in a video where I'm explaining how their electoral strategies don't work. And it's because that's all you really have left, is this feeling that we can somehow, like, our purity will somehow, like, help us muscle through in politics. And that's the thing too. I always hate the idea that we just need to wake up voters and eventually they'll be over on our side. And like you said, it's like the carbon tax thing. People are not on your side because they haven't been woken up yet. They probably fully understand your platform. They can probably tell you the things that they disagree and agree with. There's a vibe issue that you have as to why right now in the situation that you just don't mesh with them as an individual.
And I think, like, just to circle back to the carbon tax as a good case study again. Well, in 2021, people were looking at the carbon tax. The economy was mostly fine, and everyone just had a huge glut of cash thrown at them over the pandemic because of various programs supported people. So people economically were doing fine. The inflation was low. Interest rates were really low. Other than, like, there was obviously COVID, but we were in the recovery phase. It was looking upwards. And in 2019, even earlier, it wasn't great, but it was looking fine. So everyone's looking at this and it's like, everything's mostly fine. And yeah, we probably should do something about the climate. Like, that's something we should do. We have the resources. Let's do it. What changed is we no longer had the resources for it. People were like, well, screw the climate. Pretty much. That's kind of what it is, right? Like,
and the biggest asset the PPC ever had was, not to make this an entirely PPC-based discussion, was Aaron O'Toole. And when your biggest asset is just the fact that nobody likes the other guy, that's a really bad brand to be running on, is just that we're not the other guy. Like, it was clever, but it was, like, obviously sort of a self-defeating slogan that they would put up on billboards in 21 election. If you ever saw those, like the vote PPC, all the other options suck. That, okay, but why you after all that? Everyone else sucks, but why should I just not vote in general? You might suck just not as much as the other guys.
That's a really classic campaign flaw, where the U.S. Republicans actually make this problem, like, perpetually, just perennially. They're just awful at campaigning, where they spend so much time attacking the other person that they never actually define themselves. So voters are like, but who are you, though?
Yeah, it's always just the implication that, no, but I'm a real America First type, like, Republican. And so, like, I'm remembering the videos that Blake Masters did in Arizona for that Senate race against what was his name? It's the astronaut.
Mark Kelly.
There you go. You could argue Blake Masters lost because I think he had literally he had 15% of the budget that Mark Kelly had. Regardless, I think it was an election where people didn't actually like Mark Kelly that much, so there's a big opening to win even with not that much money. Lee Zeldin proved that you could almost win with basically no budget. Jack Ciattarelli in New Jersey for the governor's race proved that you can win with no budget. So Blake Masters, though, in the ads I did catch of him, a lot of it was, well, this guy's done this bad and this bad and this bad. And I think negative campaigning works really, really well. I hate the narrative that negative campaigning doesn't work. It doesn't.
I disagree with you there, but I'll let you finish.
and we can debate that in a second. But all of the stuff was just about basically, going over Mark Kelly's bad record. And then Blake Masters never really followed up by saying, and this is what I'm going to do for you. And this is it was basically just showing, like, I'm an all-American guy who shoots guns. And it's like, okay, well, that's not I know some people, and I'm pro-gun, but there are some people out there who believe owning a gun is a personality trait, but they never actually, I still don't know a single thing about Blake Masters, even though I was following a lot of those Senate races.
I think a really good case study there, just before we go into the next, discussing in negative campaign ads, the Wisconsin Supreme Court seat that was up in 23, I think, or was it 22? Whatever. Whether the Republican, it was a nonpartisan race, but there was a Republican and a Democrat candidate because people aren't stupid and everyone knows which party supports who. The reason why the Republican guy lost, well, one of the reasons, is he spent the entire campaign letting the other person, the Democrat who ended up winning, painting him as an anti-abortion extremist, and then all he did was attack her and do nothing else. And she outspent him by an oodle's money, so she just drowned everything. So she would attack him and paint herself, and all he did was attack her. So if you think about this in aggregate, if you have a positive ad for yourself and they have a negative ad, those cancel out. So if you have no positive ads and they have negative ads, they got a blow on you. You're losing. And if you have negative ads and they have positive ads, they blocked it. So now you're taking losses and they're not. And then you lose. Like, it's simplified, but that's negative. That's how it works.
This is where we go into ads a bit, where I think negative ads, and this is where they can be ineffective. I would say, this sounds, again, hyper simplistic. This is not a profound statement at all. Bad negative ads are bad. And so a bad negative ad is just aggressively against this person, whereas it doesn't demonstrate that, I think a good negative ad goes after someone for dishonesty. It's dishonesty that people dislike. So that's where you get a classic ad like Michael Ignatieff just visiting ads from the Conservatives in 2011. Those were amazing negative ads because they point out a fundamental dishonest sort of flaw that this guy goes around referring to himself as an American, like he resident of the UK, and now he's running in Canada. There was something that it felt like there was a revelation discovered. It wasn't just that Michael Ignatieff's just some big bloated government liberal. Don't vote for him. He's a socialist. That's what people don't like. That just sounds grumpy. People don't want to vote for the grumpy guy. But if you kind of come to people and you make these, and if your negative ad has more of that feel of like hey, he's running on this, but really when you look at his record, he's never done that in his life. That would be a good negative ad type narrative, is that you almost kind of come in, you're sort of like leveling with people. It almost makes you seem like the very reasonable guy. I'm positive, but hey, I hate to have to do this. And good negative ads either stay very neutrally toned about yourself, or they seem almost apologetic in having to ever even make it. A terrible negative ad is the face ad in 93.
So what I'll just say there, so I think you're broadly right, and I think we might just have our disagreement that we haven't really even touched on yet, but anyways, might more be terminology. When I think of attack ads or negative ads, I'm usually picturing the ones that is like Harper's "He's Just Not Ready" ad for Trudeau in 2015.
That one's a terrible one, and that's the positioning of it, is that the language is totally off.
So like the problem with ads like that, which to me, incidentally, I've not done a proper survey on this, but incidentally seems like most of the negative ads I see, and why those don't work very well, is you're not actually saying anything in that ad. If you do the ad as Wyatt described here, where you're talking about, he says this, but he's doing that, like the Ignatieff just visiting ad, that can work. I don't disagree there. But the attack ads that I'm thinking of in my head, like the he's not ready, why does that not work? Well, it's because
there's an absence of a criticism there, if I could answer, and then you could correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. So there is an absence of criticism. So you're just because in a sense, actually, if you look into that sentence, he's just not ready. You're actually agreeing that Trudeau should be prime minister.
Yeah, just in 5 years, maybe he can take another swing at it, and it invites the viewer to say, "Well, I actually do think he's ready right now." And know what's the worst part of it? I've talked about this a lot, but I only came up with the phrasing just now for it. Is that people don't like to be told by an authority figure that they're not ready for something, and so they're actually wanting to stick by the person that everyone's saying can't do it. They're like, "No, I think he can," and that's where, like, honestly, the follow up from Justin Trudeau, and this is where I will compliment Justin Trudeau on his ability to market well. I think his abilities are very rusty these days because he got used to the media basically cleaning up all of his messes. But I heard from someone who worked on that Liberal campaign. They used to be a Liberal and now a very strong Conservative. They say that, that escalator ad that Trudeau followed that one up with to counter it, he's walking up the wrong way of the escalator, basically saying, "You know what, I'm not ready for whatever. It was a bunch of stuff the Harper government was supposedly doing wrong." I heard he only did that in one take. They just were walking through an airport and there's like an empty area with like an escalator, and they're like, "Can we start this up and quickly film an ad?" And he did it one take, and he basically devised that entire ad within like 20 minutes. And it's like, that was great because it was like the greatest counterpunch ever. A negative ad should never have a counterpunch available of like it should never pose a question that the other person can then answer, because there was an implied question of he's just not ready, and there was a follow-up that it allowed him to do. A good negative ad is that he said this, but he's a liar and he did this, and he has no, and you would, and how you would make it terrible is you would say, and he has no intention of doing it now. Because that allows the person to counter and say, "What are you talking about? For the last 2 years, I've been actually working very hard to get this done." You just say that he's failed before, or he's always failed.
And I'll just give another...
A negative ad also should, on that, not sorry to cut you off, but a negative ad should also have a finality to it. He's just visiting. It is painting you the picture that Ignatieff is going to get on a plane and leave right afterwards after he loses.
I'll just say there as well, there is the other big issue you can run into when you're running negative ads is it's kind of like the response negative ad. If you do your negative ad as the initial thing, like that, it is the ad. That can work in one way, but the big issue is when it comes in as the response. The response negative ad is actually quite terrible. And now, this was never run as like the official thing, but a lot of surrogates for the Liberal Party did this back in March 2023. When Poilievre did his video in Newfoundland talking about the sealing industry and changing sealing quotas, and to help the fisheries in Atlantic Canada and stuff like that, by controlling the sealing population, etc., seal population, a lot of Liberal surrogates tested this out, and it immediately failed really hard, and they were attacking Poilievre because he's like, "Oh, you want to kill cute seals? How dare you want to club baby seals?" Which technically, just to be for the record, that's already illegal, so that's just kind of an irrelevant statement, but that they made. But the reason why that retort response doesn't work very well is usually if someone like Poilievre or any other leader is making an ad for, say, supporting the sealing industry in Newfoundland, they're targeting a specific type of voter that's usually someone that they think is winnable, and is usually opposed by someone they think is unwinnable, because basically every issue has voters on either side, and if you pick one side, you're intrinsically saying, "I don't want the other side." That's why you can't win everybody, because every decision throws away voters, because you can't win everybody. They disagree on things. And the voter in that case that Poilievre's throwing away is the urbanite, soft environmentalist type, who's not like environmentalists like my CO2 emissions and climate change, but environmentalists like wildlife preservation and stuff like that. I don't want to kill baby seals. That voter is someone Poilievre's throwing away. So by surrogates attacking Poilievre for this, they're really just reinforcing voters that Poilievre actually intentionally alienated to the Liberals, and are intentionally alienating voters that Poilievre's trying to win. So in that case, Poilievre's main ad is actually inviting the attack. He wants that attack ad. because that attack ad's actually what sells and cements his pitch more than his actual own ad itself. And that's where
Here,
attack ads can be really dangerous if you use them.
also when the whole narrative can be literally spun back on you so easily. A recent example, terrible attack ads, just like I don't know who devised it, was the Alberta NDP, and this was such a winnable race for the Alberta NDP in 23. The stupid ads of what is Danielle Smith going to do next, and acting like they would have like pictures of her with a weather vane coming out of her head. Oh, she can do anything on any day. And I know the guy. I'm going to just plug him because I think more people should know that he did this. Randy Kerr, working for the UCP, was the original one. His signs, the ones he was originally using, will look different than the ones that the UCP then professionally made later. I think he spent his own money just proving it would work, legally spending in an election. But when all these billboards started going up around around Calgary, it was kind of like the ones that sat on the ground, not way up in on a massive billboard, large lawn sign type things. And he would go around with smaller lawn signs with all these ads that said, "What's she gonna do next?" And he just put them down in front and just said, "Cut taxes." And it's like, dude, that was such an open goal. That sign might as well have just had a little hole in the bottom middle of it, just so that another sign could be inserted there. It's such a dumb thing to do because they're just assuming that every voter has such negative feelings towards Danielle Smith that they're gonna fill in the blanks the way that they want them to. Never in a marketing effort give the consumer or the voter the chance to add in their own answer, because that person is not you and they're not going to get your message because they're not you. So when you open up the especially when an ad is you have the ability to parody it. It's horrible, but yet never give people the open opportunity to answer the questions that you pose. That's what He's Just Not Ready did. And that's what a lot of other bad negative ads do. The face ad where it opens up with, "Is this a prime minister?" Because everyone who thinks "screw you" is going to say, "Yes, that is. Now shut up. I don't care what's wrong with them." And that's the worst, because at no point does it even land a blow on Chrétien back in '93.
There's a good non-political case study of this. If you've ever watched the YouTube channel The Internet Historian, he has a video about failed business advertising through the internet by like polls or whatever. And there's one in that video, I can't think of the name of the video off the top of my head, where McDonald's does this campaign of like hashtag just McDonald's things on Twitter. And then at first people are just saying like things that just happened at McDonald's that were nice. Like, I got an extra sauce. And then like people are like, oh, I could just use this hashtag to say whatever I want. And people are just telling horror stories.
I was groped in the bathroom by Ronald McDonald. I saw that video.
Yeah, it's like, there was a rat in the food. Stuff like that. And it's like, some of them were real, some of them were fake. And it's like, well, you don't let people... You don't want to pose your question in your marketing campaign or your political campaign.
This is why you never use polls on X in order to try and pump up your party. Like, let's put up a straw poll, because someone's going to use it and make you look like a fool by even briefly flipping the poll on you. Because never put up something where it's just a show of force for your fans, because you could easily have that flipped on you. There's so many things that parties do where they're really just trying to pump up their own crowds, and it becomes a litmus test on how healthy the party is. Happens so often with the PPC. They do so many things to basically do shows of force that look how many people like the PPC, and they're like, look, Maxime Bernier got 93% of the vote in his leadership review, even though it's kind of nonsense because he got to choose when it was, so he chose it at the moment where everyone liked him the most, not now. He would never call it now. And they're like, he got 93% of the leadership review, and then they release the results, and it's like, and only like 20,000 people are members of your party? That's kind of sad after the election that you guys just had, where you somehow doubled your vote and everyone hated the Conservatives at the time and the Liberals. You only have 20,000 members? Never do that. Never open the back end of your party for criticism. This is why parties do not release nomination voting results. They do not want you to know how close it might have been between maybe a very good candidate and a nutbag.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually one of the issues I think the Conservative Party has historically had. They publish every single round, which, yeah, it's great for people like me to talk about it on the internet, but that's also why it's not great for a party to do it. Because then oh yeah, look, Leslie Lewis only lost in round 2 because of voter inefficiency. Oh, oops.
Yeah, a really great moment for the PPC for 21 is being able to recognize the provinces that they should focus on getting out votes and memberships for, because we can see where Leslie Lewis did well. It's like, okay, go to that riding. Yeah, I'm definitely not going to this riding that Aaron O'Toole did well in.
So it gets it's a very dangerous game to release that data.
Yeah,
There's a reason why a lot of data is not actually released. For example, most polls don't actually release race data, but every poll collects it pretty much.
mm-hmm.
And that's because people are afraid of saying it. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Or, sorry. If there's what I mean is whether they should be scared of that, I don't know. But they are. And I can guarantee you that they are scared of it because they don't publish it. Like, I know Ledger, for a fact, collects that data. They never publish it, though. Publicly.
Mm-hmm.
Main Street's the only one who does, actually, but they have it behind a paywall, so it's not even really public. It's like public in the sense that anyone can pay for it.
But you might get attacked if you like publish it and you try and draw attention to it because now you're the weirdo.
Now you are breaking their their subscriber agreement, so you are technically breaking the law. Though,
yeah,
it would be very difficult to enforce that law.
Because you like, yeah, it's like exclusive information that once it goes into your eyes, you're not allowed to go like tell someone else about it.
And you could also say, "Oh, I didn't get this. Someone gave it to me."
Or even then, like, if someone asked you a question on Twitter of like, well, what do you think the breakdown is for whoever votes liberal? And you're like, oh, actually, I know it. And then you just tell them what it is. It's like Main Street going to come and chop off your hands because, oh, you told someone. Like, well, I know the answer. Or do I have to now lie every time someone asks a relevant question?
But then you have the
They
problem
also should
too.
just realize people are going to subscribe if they want the numbers as fast as humanly possible. And that's really it. Not because we're all stealing it. No one sends it to me. And it's not because they're enforcing their rules well. It's just because most people are too lazy to, like, go around spreading the word because it's not that interesting to most people.
And the other flip side of that too is let's say the courts would never rule this, even in Canada where our courts are crazy. But if you asserted that they had to now lie about that data that they saw and they know now, and you said that's true, well then people could just look at the opposite of what you just said. And just if they know that Chris knows the Main Street data, so if he says the Conservatives are in second place with the white people, he's probably lying to us because the law says he has to lie to us. So that means he's probably in first place.
Yeah.
So it doesn't. You might lose like the fine details of the numbers, but the general actual relevant part is still there.
Here's a random thing we can maybe end this on. Because the thing is that maybe this could even be a follow-up, almost a mini teaser for if we ever film another one of these, is that I always wanted to talk about, because have you ever seen the channel Stephen Michael Davis?
No.
I really recommend his short 3 or 4 video series on why Bernie Sanders lost the 2016 or 2020 Democratic primary. He goes into both, but basically he does a lot of discussion on voter choice theory and the way that voters think, and just basically because there's a lot of narratives that like the election was stolen from Bernie Sanders in 2020 and he should have been able to win, but the Democratic establishment basically manipulated things in order to beat him. And in Canada, you actually do get a lot of manipulation within nomination races. It's just how it works. It's fully run by the party itself, and they everything's very hidden. But in the U.S., it's not. Everything's actually very open and honest in their primaries. But he basically breaks down, and I think this is actually a very correct thing. I hate, honestly, the term establishment. I find it's a completely worthless categorization, is to call someone establishment or not. Establishment really, in a lot of ways, just means popular. there's a reason why Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, where they are senators and representatives, are very popular and keep getting reelected. It's because people like them. And I think this is also the problem that a lot of populists have in politics, is that they don't understand, and this again circles a little bit back to the PPC, but it also actually does apply heavily to the NDP. No surprise that they're the ones who had Bernie Sanders come to their convention, is that they don't understand that something being establishment is actually a very positive thing for a lot of voters, and not in like a corrupt way that I want to vote for the establishment party. Maybe they'll hand me out a benefit. Like, no. They're establishment because they actually occupy the normal kind of range of views for most voters. Most voters are actually fairly like non what I would say, like, I guess, noteworthy in their views. There's nothing really out of the ordinary. It seems like almost like someone's order at a restaurant. They're not really going to knock your socks off on what they're going to order when there's a set menu of general things that you would expect people to have.
Yeah, it's like, imagine going to McDonald's and expecting someone to order
Like
a steak.
the salmon.
It's like, they don't sell salmon. Like,
yeah, like, and you have to, and people have to realize that that's why places like parties like the PPC, actually marketing yourself as anti-establishment is a stupid thing to do, because there's a lot of negative implications baked into not being establishment. If anything, you actually want to advertise yourself as occupying the middle ground in terms of political thought, not in terms of being some sort of like middle of the road fence riding centrist where you take no position on anything and you turn into Aaron O'Toole. He proved that that's wildly unpopular. But you want to market your views as being very widely appealing, whereas so many people actually think obscurism is the way to win. And the idea is that somehow if you don't win or you're unable to appeal to people, it's somehow like some establishment trick. This happens a lot with Bernie Sanders believing, and his team believing, that somehow they lost in 2020 because the Democratic Party screwed him over. And then you get a lot of the PPC people who think that like Warren Kinsella or some other like, nefarious conservative agent undermined them in the 2019 or 2021 elections or the by-elections. It's like, it's just not true. People didn't vote for you. Like I've said multiple times now in this podcast, they didn't vote for you because they don't like you. And they don't like you because you have not talked about issues that they actually care about. And the reason why the other parties are establishment is because they're actually doing certain things right. And you might want to learn from them. And we have a bit of a culture right now that if you don't like someone, or you think they're corrupt, or you think that they're somehow like, selling people short, is that you shouldn't emulate them in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a bit of a random rant.
No, I think you summarized it pretty good. Though, I think that will be possibly a cliffhanger for another episode in the future. And if you want more episodes of this kind of stuff, comment below and let us know. And otherwise, we will see you some other time in the future with something else one day, maybe. Who knows? Comment below.